So now we're on to the chapter on Latin X. So that's lecture 11. First, I think it's important that we discuss that terms like Hispanic and Latin, Chicano, are in many ways just inventions of classification. Most Hispanics identify by country identity, rather, like being Mexican or El Salvador or Colombian, not by a white census code variant called Spanish surname that was then put into Hispanic. Um, while some may feel a commonality in language, the fact is that Hispanic is really a term that white folks have invented. And when it was invented, Hispanics were very suspicious of this new category because, again, every time white folks come up with a new category, it generally doesn't work out for the group being categorized. So let's start by looking at the Spanish financing of Christopher Columbus. That's literally how Europeans get a toehold into the Americas. And you see Native American communities being conquered and exterminated. Columbus, conquistadors like De Soto, Cortez, Pizarro. They import something called the Spanish caste system, where terms like mulatto and mestizo, where folks that had intermarried with black folks were mulatto, with Native Americans, mestizo. We get the term manifest destiny. And what's interesting about that is when we talk about these terms, often they're like, oh my God, what I got to remember all this ancient nonsense. Well, we're hearing that today in 2025. We're hearing terminology about manifest destiny, that America gets to take things. Right now, the discussion is the Panama Canal, uh, some overtures to Greenland and Canada. So clearly, these ideas, again, also rooted in white supremacy, are rearing their heads again. I want you to know the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. This comes about. General Jackson, at the time, is invading Spanish-held Florida to attack the Seminoles because they are harboring escaped slaves. And this idea was that Spain wasn't controlling these Indians and the slaves were being allowed to run away, and that just wasn't tolerable. And this pretense was used to take Florida from Spain. Spain agreed to sort of a more firm commitment to Texas, though the U.S. doesn't spend much time honoring that, continues to go west, not honoring these treaties. You have the independence of Mexico in 1821, and you have Mexico in 1829 declaring slavery illegal. And this is the real grievance of Texans, or often referred to as Texicans, because in 1829 there's no more immigration from the north and slavery is outlawed. Texas gains its independence in 1836. Again, fight for white supremacy and being able to hold slaves, not freedom. I noticed that John Wayne movies and books are always trying to wrap that period of history up as if, they were fighting for freedom against Santa Anna. And in fact, what they were fighting for was to hold slaves, steal more money from indigenous people and eventually Mexican people. President James Polk kicks off the Mexican-American War in 1846, and in short order occupies Mexico City. They sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is basically signed at gunpoint, where Mexico has to give up half its territory. So America can and get this whole idea of manifest destiny going all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. What's interesting and something that I think isn't often said is the issue those people at the time that were in the Mexican area, before it became the Western United States, these 30,000 plus people became U.S. citizens. They just woke up one day and they were U.S. citizens. And technically, they didn't have to learn a new language. When people are talking about, English first and English is the American language, those people were made citizens, as good as any other citizen. And they didn't have to become white. Now, later, Anglo-conformity is pushed upon them to try to force an idea of otherness on people that spoke Spanish and that were of Mexican ancestry. But technically, it didn't have to be that way. Then I want you to know the Monroe Doctrine. This is America's claim basically to the entire hemisphere, and that no European country could or should have any influence in the Americas, only the United States. Building on that, you have the Spanish-American War of 1898, where we take over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We've already talked about the Philippines, but Puerto Rico again becomes this protectorate, and the people there to this day live under a system where they're not fully a state, and they're not fully themselves. In 1920, a group is called LULAC is created to fight for Mexican American rights, Hispanic rights in America. And this is important because I don't feel like your book goes very much into what happened in 1930s, the early 1930s. The Hoover administration deports 1.8 million mostly Americans of Mexican heritage. And they do this on purpose. We are seeing again the parallel today with this talk of mass deportation by the incoming administration, part of what's called Project 2025. And again, how did that happen? Well, for example, in Los Angeles, how it happened was they went into the hospitals and started with hospital patients, basically pushing hospital patients out the front doors. And why was this deportation program happening? Because of white economic fears in the Great Depression. And Hoover even ran on a platform of American jobs for real Americans. And some of us might go, wow, that's sounding kind of familiar. In the 1940s, we have something called the Zoot Suit Riots and the Bracero program. We're both going to get into a little bit more of that in a bit. But again, what we see with the Bracero program is with everybody fighting, we needed somebody to help harvest the food and help grow the food. And that's what had happened. We had basically deported a bunch of people in the 1930s with anti-Mexican sentiment, but when we enter the war and we need people, we ask Mexicans to come to the United States and help us. And this was called the Bracero program. Mexican Americans were fighting kind of their own cultural fight with the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles, where anti-Mexican sentiment was being fueled often by white, mostly sailors into Los Angeles, that hadn't really encountered people from Mexico very often, and were struck by the fact that they weren't, just bowing down to white power, since Los Angeles had been historically a city founded with Mexican identity, Hispanic language, Spanish language, Hispanic cultural identity. So we're going to get into the Zoot Suit riots more. Hang on. We get our word for this 11A lecture, and the word is Pachuco, 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 which was kind of a slang word for punk, but a lot of Mexican Americans that wore zoot suits had adopted this identity. So let's talk about the zoot suit riots. It comes on the heels of a murder in 1942. A guy named Jose Diaz is killed, and 600 people are picked up, mainly Mexican American youth, 12 to 25-year-old men, and the police are basically identifying them as being potentials with suspects by the zoot suit, which was a long coat, high-waisted pants with suspenders, was called peg leg balloon pants, where they had ballooning out at the hips but then tight at the ankles. And this starts a lot of tension between Mexican Americans and the mostly white police in Los Angeles. At the time, a bunch of Hispanic boys and girls were picked up, and the trial there was covered by the newspapers. You see different people coming to the Hispanic young boys that had been picked up and charged with crime. 17 defendants, biggest trial in California at that time. And the judge denies all objections. The Hispanic kids were drug in, dirty, still from the clothes that they had been picked up in, months and months and months before. And with no surprise, sure enough, there is a guilty verdict. Actors join in the defense fund, and you start seeing this kind of polarization in Los Angeles. A forgotten part of that is 8 Mexican-American women that are picked up refuse to cooperate with the DA, but because they were under the age of 21, they're sent to reform school, basically with no real charges, and they're sent to jail. And actually, some of them serve as long as the boys. Anyway, in June of 1943, you have an event that basically brings it all to a head. Sailors, in June of 1943, grab a Mexican American kid and get into a fight and break the guy's jaw. The town erupts. Sailors left the armory to go downtown to attack Zoot Suit people. This goes on for several nights. The barrio fights back. About 5,000 civilians are involved. Soldiers abandon their posts, go AWOL, are stripping kids as young as 12 and 13 if they're wearing Zoot Suits. And the LAPD, again showing its colors, arrest only Zoot Suit wearing Mexican Americans. The MPs in the Shore Patrol are allowed to arrest civilians too. Eventually, Zoot Suits are banned by the city, and eventually the young men that had been charged with the Jose Diaz crime are eventually released, and the people that were put into the jails for the Zoot Suit riot were eventually also freed. But you see, again, anything that goes against white identity and any group that is refusing to stay subservient is then violently oppressed.